of time, we'll start straight away. Thank you for joining us in Oriana's Oriana Financial's webinar for this month, Smart Move Relocation Tips for Expatriates. My name is Mudigdo. I'm one of the senior wealth advisors with Oriana Private Wealth, and I'm very pleased to have you all here. We're very fortunate to also be joined by Patrick O'Donnell, CEO of Links Moving Asia, as well as Shaun Maloney, a senior advisor with iFast Financial, who will help me go through the topic and lend their deep expertise on the matter. Before we actually begin in earnest, a few housekeeping matters. Please keep yourself on mute, and please use the Q&A button for questions if you'd like to ask any of the panelists of any questions on their session. Time permitting, we'll be able to either to attend them during the session or at the end if we still have time. If not, feel free to engage, to contact us and engage us offline. Our details will also be part of our reach out after this webinar. So in terms of the agenda today, we'll be going through to talk about matters around relocation, which is obvious, which is quite a, I guess it comes hand in hand with being an expatriate, particularly in Asia. So we're very fortunate to have Patrick, and the first point that we will be attending to is a bit of a Q&A session with Patrick regarding relocation tips. I will then go through a quick checklist of what to think about when you are leaving Hong Kong from a financial perspective, logistical issue, as well as if you are returning to Australia, what are the type of things that you'd want to think about. Shaun then will complete the webinar by talking about all things Singapore related, in terms of property there, how to the type of considerations you need to also take into account when you are looking at a move to Singapore. In terms of the speakers themselves, we have, as I've already mentioned, we have got Patrick O'Donnell and Shaun Maloney. I'll go through a quick bio of them each. Patrick has had 30 years of experience in the international relocation industry and the international logistic business through running Links Logistics, which is based in Guangzhou in China, and is currently founding member of the LogNet network, which is a global logistics network. Patrick's company, Links Move Asia, has had a very busy 2022, where they had, on a year-to-date basis, helped more than 3,000 families relocate from Macau and Hong Kong to other places. So no doubt his experience in the field and advice will be of great value during the talk today. Shaun Maloney, Senior Advisor for iFast Financial Singapore, has over 10 years experience in financial services in Australia and Singapore, with expertise across financial planning, investment markets, wealth creation and preservation. Shaun himself has relocated to Singapore from 2018, so he's well versed in the, I guess, in the relocation issues and what to look out for. He himself, as an advisor, focuses on building long-term relationships with clients and centering it around a comprehensive strategic advice to achieve their personal and financial goals. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from Deakin University, and he's fully licensed through iFast Singapore and regulated and licensed through the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So those are our speakers we are very fortunate to have today. We'll go straight through to the first session, which is a relocation tips Q&A with Patrick. I guess if you look at it objectively, relocation is really part and parcel of living and working overseas, whether you do it a number of times or you only do it once. There will come a time which you will be posed with this question of what to do. So I'd like to bring Patrick at this point. Well, he'll attend a few questions that we've collected from the audience as part of your registration. But before going through that, Patrick, can I get your view on the state of relocations, the relocation services market, and the period that we've actually just gone through? What stands out for you compared to how work has been, in times prior to that?
Thank you, Andre. I think the major change, which I think everyone relocating on the entire planet has had to deal with, has been this huge hike in ocean freight rates. The shipping lines worked their supply very well, and they implemented some of the biggest hikes in shipping rates that we'd ever seen. So that meant that clients had to choose what they wanted. It was no longer just the companies paying for it, unloading a container, put it all in. They really had to start choosing, and it made for quite a change in the entire industry. A lot of companies had been set up to handle big full container loads, and all of a sudden they were handling much smaller shipments but greater numbers of shipments. So it was a real challenge in the entire industry, not to mention all the supply shocks that went around the industry during the COVID reopening, shutting down, opening periods, made it very challenging. There were lots of challenges.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. So in a nutshell, really, it's about the rates, the spike, I guess, in terms of the pricing side of things.
Yeah, Andre, really, it sort of took off in COVID, and it would be best analogy as a plane flying at 30,000 feet. It took off, and then it sustained at that level, and only now is it starting to come down. Right. To more levels which are more in par with norm.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that, Patrick. So we'll go through some of the questions that we've collated. And again, if you do still have any questions for Patrick, please feel free to use the Q&A chat button, where we can attend to either during the session or at the very end. So Patrick, please.
Okay, look, I think it always helps to be 2 or 3 months ahead and contacting your removalist. And if it is before a peak period, like the end of a school term, you should be planning about 4 months. If you don't give your removalist enough time, everything's a scramble. It can happen. They're good. They can get things done, but yeah, it's just make sure you allow enough time for it, okay? Sometimes because of changes in work, that doesn't happen, and we are here to respond, but if you can, please allow the time.
Okay.
I think I've addressed that in that question to Andre. I mean,
yes,
the huge hike in rates, and it meant that people had to choose what they wanted to ship. So we saw a lot of the sofas, the big wardrobes, you know, just weren't being shipped, the coffee tables and that. Yeah. So people really did have to choose what was their essential possessions. Okay.
Is it worthwhile to shop around, Patrick, for lack of a better expression, in terms of providers, or this is really an industry-wide type of issue that you're all facing, really?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what's happened in the shipping market is there are really only about 4 major consortiums and of shipping lines, so they control where the rates are.
Okay.
Okay, everyone's got to buy from them, so. Yep. Yeah, it is the market, so to speak.
Understood.
Okay, so coming on to pets. Now, pets can be the most emotive thing in an entire relocation. We per se don't really handle pets. We've just become too busy with handling clients at the moment. But pets, you need to plan early, particularly to Australia or New Zealand. You need to be contacting your vet and understanding what sort of tests and paperwork and chips that you require the animal to go through. Sometimes it can take up to 12 months of planning. So really, you have to get onto this probably as soon as you get onto your tax planning. You have to get onto it. It got very challenging in COVID. Cathay dropped doing all pets. Most airlines dropped doing all pets. At one stage, it was only British Airways. And we quoted for 2 dogs that needed to go to Sapporo, Japan, and they were quoted going to Heathrow and staying in British Airways pet hotel and then flying back out to Tokyo. Right, that's how crazy it really got. So once you've got all the tests and that lined up and done, talk to the airlines, because many of them now are starting to offer your pet to go as unaccompanied baggage, and then you can work with your vet to do preparatory tests, which you need to do before the animal flies, and you can buy the carrier and arrange a lot of it yourself. particularly the American Airlines, United have always been very good on this. Okay, so yeah, there are definitely options there. Now, when it comes to vehicles to Singapore, I've never shipped one, right? Which is not diplomatic. I've shipped hundreds of vehicles all over the world, but I've never shipped one for a regular non-diplomatic client to Singapore, and that is because the import tax and the certificate of entitlement and other costs, which Shaun will go into, are very, very expensive. Now, when coming to ship a car to Australia, you must have owned it for 12 months. So if you're planning to leave Hong Kong and you want to bring a car, which is actually quite a good idea, you will notice that the second-hand car cost in Australia has really risen. You have to have owned it for 12 months. The important sort of consideration with the car is you need vehicle import approval from Canberra before you can load the car. They put this in place about over a decade ago because there was substandard cars were being imported from Japan. And it remains in place now. So even if you've got the best car in the world, you need to get their approval to ship it. Okay, and that probably takes 2 or 3 months. Okay, so it's worth doing that. You need to pay attention to the luxury car tax in Australia when it arrives. Make sure that the book value or the common value that it would be assigned to that model and that make does not exceed the luxury car tax threshold in Australia. Otherwise, you will be up for an extra tax. But it is a very good idea to send your car down to Australia at the moment. Now, the other thing to realize is you need your Hong Kong vehicle registration cancelled. Okay, now the Transport Department in Hong Kong won't cancel it until the car is in a container. And that means that you have probably left, the car's in a container, and that's a service we do. You are dealing with the Hong Kong government. The paperwork has to be exact. You know, the utility bill has to match the exact address that you have on your vehicle license and all the rest of it. But and then what they'll do is they will cancel it, and then we courier it to Australia, and you will need this to get the car re-registered in Australia or New Zealand or elsewhere or the UK. So that's something you've got to pay some attention to. All right. Okay. And just with shipping a car, it is considered a dangerous goods to the shipping line. So no more than 25% of petrol in the car. That's always advisable. Okay, I think so. So border control, I think is the next sort of thing. I'll start with Singapore first. Singapore is mainly electronic clearance, and it works very smoothly. The major issue is how close can the shipment get to your condo or residence? The condos normally ask the movers to pay quite a significant security deposit. Okay, and there are certain days like weekends where they won't allow deliveries. So a lot of times container shipments need to be shuttled to the condo or residence in Singapore. The other challenge in Singapore at the moment is it's taking, because of the huge demand, which Shaun will talk about, it's taking 2 or 3 months for people to find apartments. So most of the shipments are going into storage, and people should think about maybe a small urgent shipment that's delivered out to the service department, because if you happen to be in the service department 6 weeks or 10 weeks, you want certain things around you. You don't necessarily want them just sitting in a warehouse in Singapore. Okay, so if that's done at origin, then that's easy to get that delivery out to you. Now, when it comes to Australia, there are more than usual delays going on at the moment. What we call the AQIS officers they are severely understaffed at the moment. I think this is a bounce back from COVID. I spoke to Sydney this morning, and they were saying that they are at only 50% of their normal inspection. So if they were clearing 20 shipments a day, normally they are only clearing 10 a day. This is a medium-term problem. The major import season for both people and all commodities into Australia is the summer, November, December, and January. So they in Sydney don't think there'll be any abatement until February. And these services, these government services, are understaffed, and they're trying to train more people, and that's why it's a medium-term problem. Case in point, we had a container arrive on the 27th of October, and they're struggling to deliver it by November 20th. Now, the movers want to deliver it. They don't want their yard entirely full of shipments or their warehouse full, but it is it's the government departments, customs, and Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, which is the AQIS officers, which are slowing things down at the moment. Okay, are there any sort of considerations if you're going to store your goods for a while? I think it's great to do a sort of pre-pack of a lot of the soft items. That can also reduce the volume of your shipment. So you can use vacuum bags. We provide clients with vacuum bags. You can use vacuum bags with silica gel, and you can pack these shipments and make them ready for storage. And then try and run your dehumidifiers as much as possible. Make the house as dry as possible. Air conditioners and dehumidifiers, make the ambient temperature as dry as possible, and keep everything sort of clean. It goes without saying, if you're shipping into Australia, quarantine will inspect your shipments. So anything that comes into contact with soil, golf clubs, rugby boots, any sort of sporting equipment, it has to be spotless, has to be very clean. Likewise, it's always a good idea to have a car detailed before you send it. It really needs to be clean. Okay. So in terms of insurance, in the past, you probably had more latitude to buy insurance from different brokers. There have been a lot of changes in the conditions because of COVID, and I think you're better to buy it through the mover. Particularly when it comes to extended SIT. I had a conversation with Chubb recently, and they didn't want to extend the insurance of a client longer than 60 days. Well, you know, that's just not right. So they're also struggling. Some of the outside brokers are struggling with lump sum insurance. They don't really understand how it works. So I think you're better to buy it through the mover. Make sure you've got the right insurance for the right sort of relocation package.
Good.
Yeah, so I think that's about it on your questions.
Yep. Thanks for that, Patrick. Appreciate it. And for those of you that probably missed any of that, we will be sending you a recording of this webinar as part of our reach out. So don't worry too much about it. And you can still ask questions, which Patrick, if you can still stay online until the end, that's cool. Because as you can just see, everyone, he's got very deep knowledge on this matter. And I'm sure just by answering those questions, he's added a lot of value for those of you moving back, and things that we don't really just think about, or front of mind anyway. So I'll continue on with that, I guess, with this relocation theme, but focusing more on those of you that are in Hong Kong and leaving either that back to Australia or elsewhere. For the content today, what I'd like to really focus more on is, I guess, different to the logistical matters that Patrick has kindly brought to light. It's more about the financial considerations of leaving Hong Kong. In our experience, this comes down to three things for our clientele, our Australian clientele anyway. It's clearing your taxes in Hong Kong, just making sure that you finalize your tax obligations with the island. withdrawing your MPF, which is the pension fund that we run here, and also some of the considerations of, when you are, I guess, starting back in Australia again, what are the financial considerations in light of, I guess, your journey overseas and actually resetting back in Australia from a financial standpoint. So the first two is probably more logistical in nature, but there are a few nuances, if you like. Not surprisingly, as Patrick has mentioned, you will be dealing with Hong Kong authority, which is quite precise. Is probably that the right word, Patrick? In their nature, so it actually is of use of us going through this. So the first thing that you need to do is, if you're looking at, I guess, the website, the Hong Kong government website, they do suggest 1 month before leaving, no later, that you inform the revenue department of your intention to move permanently out of Hong Kong. I'd say give yourself a bit more leeway than that, just to make sure that you have all the paperwork, etc., and they're well informed well before that one month period. And the intention is for you to complete a final tax return, right? To inform them, and for you, the next step is to complete your final tax return. There's two parts of this. One part is you finalizing your tax return as you have done in your previous stay in Hong Kong, up in your previous financial years, I should say. And the difference is now you will be marrying that final tax return with some paperwork that your employer has completed. Specifically, there's a particular form, it's called IR56G. It's like a termination form of some sort, along with the termination notice that the employer has completed for you as well. Another, I guess, empirically, it's been suggested that if once you have your documentation for your final tax return, a copy of that IR56 form from your employer, make an appointment with an officer at the revenue department to submit it, rather than having it sent by email or via post. Evidence suggests that it's much quicker that way if you do have an officer that's attending to this, and you'll have a quicker outcome. Once you have submitted this and receive the final assessment, the final assessment itself can actually be, you might get it on the same day if you are paying your taxes in cash. But once you have received that, the outcome is for you to receive what's called a letter of release. This letter of release actually serves two outcomes as well. One is that that means that your employer can actually pay your final months of salary. They need to actually withhold your final months of salary before and receive that letter of release before actually paying that through. The other part is I'll talk about the MPF. It's actually also an important document that the MPF trustee will require. Just before I go to the MPF, what I'd also like to point out is that it's beneficial for you to receive any work-related bonuses prior to you leaving Hong Kong, compared as opposed to receiving your bonuses when you are back in Australia, because what you'd want is those bonuses being part of, I guess, your Hong Kong tax return, because of obviously the differential in the tax rates. If you are, for instance, as an example, if you're staying with the same company but receiving the bonus once you're in Australia, that bonus will be part of your income tax in Australia for that financial year. In terms of withdrawing your MPF of your pension fund, no doubt a lot of you would have built up, quite a significant amount of MPF, notwithstanding the volatile markets at the moment. But if the intention is for you to permanently leave Hong Kong, then armed with that letter of release, you can apply for what's called an early withdrawal under permanent departure with your MPF provider. This is an important distinction because you'd need to provide evidence that you are leaving Hong Kong on a permanent basis, and the MPF trustee would actually look for evidence for that. It's been advised that travel documents alone won't actually be sufficient. You'd need not only the letter of release, but also evidence that you have permanent employment in another country, you have residential status in another countries, even copies of utility bills being set up for you over there can be submitted as part of that evidence, right? Once you have received the MPF, again, empirically, you have to allow from up to 4 to 6 weeks for it to be paid out. So obviously, we'd need to plan this well ahead of time. The other part is that if you are looking at if you are originally looking at permanently leaving Hong Kong, but at some future stage coming back to Hong Kong and start a new employment journey, then you're you can only receive early access once. Any future MPF that you will receive will be preserved until the retirement age of 65. That would also apply for, I guess, 3-star permanent residents in Hong Kong. Well, they will still have to observe that 65 age retirement requirement. In the event that you have received the proceeds before leaving Hong Kong, that is fine. From an Australian tax, there won't be any Australian tax impact. However, if you happen to receive the proceeds when you are back onshore in Australia as an Australian tax resident, that proceeds might actually have some tax impact. At the very least, any amounts outside of the original contributions by you or your employer would potentially be seen as a taxable income for that financial year once you are an Australian tax resident. So it begs to, it does point to the suggestion that it's much better for you to receive it prior to you leaving Hong Kong, if you can actually arrange it as such. The option of, I guess, rolling it over into your superannuation in Australia is not an option, because from an ATO perspective, and Shaun will talk about the Singapore version of this, but the Hong Kong MPF is not seen as a foreign super fund, so it will be taxed as I've mentioned just then. If you have Australia as your final destination, or your next destination, I should say, some of the considerations you should have are as follows. What to do with your non-Australian assets, because now, being Australian tax residents, once back in Australia, they have a worldwide income approach, which means that any investments that you have outside of Australia would be part of your, the returns or the capital of that will be part of your, assessable income as an Australian tax resident. So you have some options to think about there. If you do have an investment portfolio, for instance, outside Australia, do you maintain it as is, even though you're going back to Australia, and maintain it as an offshore investment as an Australian tax resident? Or do you cash it out? Do you actually just have it in proceeds and reinvest it back in Australia, notwithstanding the market? So timing would be quite an important part as well. Or do you look at some left sides, out of left field solutions, such as do you roll it over into, say, a family trust in Australia, even though you yourself are a non-resident? What are the tax impact of doing so? Or do you look at a portfolio bond, for instance, which to an extent firewalls that taxation impact, but you need to preserve it for quite some time? Those are the type of things that that you need to think about, and happy to have that chat with you and to review what options best for you. The other part of being in Australia is that superannuation is a very important part of your retirement planning, retirement savings. Depending on where you are in the investment horizon discussion, superannuation in Australia is bar none the most efficient tax vehicle if you are looking at retiring back home in Australia. So it's probably a good time for you to revisit your superannuation position back in Australia. Is it worthwhile recontributing it back to super? Do you put your, the proceeds of your non-Australian assets into that vehicle? So those are the type of, I guess, retirement, because closer to retirement, most of your retirement income stream should be in superannuation because of the tax benefits that it offers, i.e., it'll get tax-free income after the age of 60 when you take it out as a pension. I have also seen a lot of clients, a number of clients anyway, leveraging on their relatively higher income levels in Hong Kong or in Singapore to refinance their existing loans, investment portfolio loans, be it interest rate is actually quite volatile at the moment, and also property prices is moving. It might be an option for you to review your lending arrangements and see if refinancing is an option for you to see whether your higher taxable income in Hong Kong anyway, or in Singapore for that matter, can be of benefit for you. There are operators in this space, focusing on Australian clients that we can refer you to in this aspect. The last two, insurance. If you have Hong Kong-based insurance or Singapore-based insurance from your work, or you hold it personally, please make sure you're comfortable of what that means if you do go back to Australia. What is the claim process? Are you still protected with the same type of terms and conditions, or is it time for you to consider to repackage it with an Australian provider, and what that looks like? And lastly, as an Australian resident, just make sure that you reapply for your Medicare cards and all the other benefits of being Australian residents, as well as private health cover. Remember, if you don't have private health cover in Australia, you might have to pay more tax due to the Medicare levy. I'll leave it there, and there are some questions coming through now that we can attend to either throughout this presentation or towards the end. But at this point, I'll bring it over to Shaun, mate, for you to go through the last part of the session, which is looking at relocating to Singapore and the considerations of doing so.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Just shared my screen there. Hopefully you can see that all okay. Yeah. Okay. As Andre mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Singapore as a destination to relocate to, and just talk about some of the considerations you should be thinking about when moving here, both from a lifestyle point of view, but also some of the financial considerations as well. So as many would know, Singapore has a fairly large expat population and consistently ranked amongst the top destinations to live and work due to its high quality of life, robust economy, and pro-business environment. And I think having Changi Airport there for quick access to weekend getaways around Southeast Asia, certainly in the last nearly 12 months now, hasn't hurt either. So what will I talk about? Just as I said, an introduction to Singapore. I thought I'd give an update on the latest kind of happenings here. Patrick's spoken about some of the things that are kind of changing with more and more expats moving around, and then touch on some of the financial considerations to think about as well. So Singapore. One of the first things that you might want to consider when moving here is probably your work pass. So it's probably the first hurdle that you need to jump through before you can actually move to Singapore. And it's a very highly competitive, much like Hong Kong, highly competitive and skilled workforce. And if you are intending to work and move here, you need to get a valid pass before you can actually move to Singapore. Each pass has certain criteria that you'll need to meet and certain conditions attached. So things ranging from salary, your age, and occupation are all going to have a different effect on what kind of passes that you're eligible to apply for and whether or not you actually be accepted to receive one of those passes. The more common passes that your family may qualify for is the employment pass, as well as the dependent pass, which is open to spouses and children of employment and S-pass holders here. I think Singapore is constantly going through, I suppose, changes, and it's a hot topic among locals around how many expats are actually moving and working in Singapore. So the government here are always kind of structuring up different kind of passes and changing the requirements as things go. We went through an election here last year, and one of the hot topics of that election was jobs for Singaporeans and the amount and I suppose the quality of expats that they're allowing to move here. So all that has an influence on whether or not you get a pass and what type of pass and what the requirements are and how they change over time. So the second consideration when moving here is probably thinking about setting up a home. So do you rent or buy? Where do you want to live? What's the location? And then what type of property do you want to live in? Singapore can be broadly split into three categories of housing, and that's public housing. So HDBs, where a large proportion of Singaporeans actually live. Condos, which are a popular choice for expats moving to Singapore, or landed properties. So things like terraces or semi-detached homes that give you a bit of land, but obviously priced based on the scarcity of land in Singapore. So buying or renting. Buying in Singapore can actually be quite preventative for expats, particularly when first moving here. This is mainly due to what's called the additional buyer's stamp duty, which the government has put in place for foreigners. And it actually requires you to pay an additional 30% in stamp duty. You're looking at normal stamp duty rates, which may depend on, I suppose, the price of the property, and then an additional 30% on top of that. So you could be looking at around 35% in stamp duty on top of the purchase price of the property, which obviously makes, in a pretty hot property market in Singapore at the moment, it obviously makes it quite expensive to buy. Because of that, most expats will generally choose to rent, at least at the start of their journey in Singapore, with renting in Singapore being quite straightforward. And as I mentioned, most expats favour condos for their homes. And probably what a lot of expats will do is actually use an agent to represent them in that property search. As Patrick kind of mentioned, there's a lot of competition for properties in Singapore at the moment, and it can take a long time to find that ideal property. And with the competition, you're not going to get approved potentially straight away. So an agent that has, I suppose, expertise in a certain area that you want to live in, they can assist you, with the process that may start before you ever move to Singapore. So then lining up, some properties for you to look at, may not be a call to get an idea of what your kind of requirements are, space, bedrooms, all that kind of stuff. And then what's probably particularly important is negotiating the lease, making sure that you're including all the right clauses, like diplomatic clauses, making sure you're covering all those things, because the property market or the rental market is very much favouring landlords in Singapore, and tenants can often get the raw end of things at the end of leases, with deposits not being returned, paying for damages and all that kind of stuff. So important to have someone that has that expertise and can kind of help you through that process. Education and schools is, for those moving with children, is generally a pretty important decision, whether that's Singapore or Australia or any other country. So the availability and quality of that education that's available in the country that you're looking to move to. And Singapore has consistently been ranked as, one of the highest in the world for education. And it's generally split into local public and private schooling. So the private schooling will generally include the international schools. It's probably important to note that expatriate children generally, they can apply for public schools, but the availability is extremely limited, and generally you won't get a place in a public school because of the priorities which are given to locals, but also to those that are actually permanent residents as well. So, a number of considerations to think about for your children. The first, probably generally one you look at, is curriculum. So, making sure that you've got a curriculum that best suits your child's needs, their education. But what might be also important is to think about, if you were moved to another country, how long is your stay in Singapore going to be for? How old are your kids? Will you move, back to Australia, to the UK? So thinking about that curriculum that might actually minimise disruption in the future is a good one to think about. Cost is always an important factor. Like Hong Kong, international school fees here are quite high. They can range from around $18,000 a year for the lower, kindergarten or younger years to close to $50,000 a year once you get into secondary schooling. And other ones, location of the campus. So in relation to where you plan to live. So you probably don't want your kids trekking across the country, even though Singapore is quite small. The bus journeys can get quite long. Thinking about the language of the schools, or what even second languages are taught at school. Holiday and term dates. And then things like, extracurricular activities that they offer, and even facilities that the school has as well. So all important things. And at the moment, demand with the world has been opening up. Singapore's been open. It's basically for the best part of nearly 12 months now. Demand is quite high, so it's very important to make sure that if you are planning that move, to kind of look at trying to register your child and look at those schooling options pretty early. So the latest happenings here. I think rental market at the moment is the hottest topic, both for locals, but probably in particular for expats, both new expats moving here as well as existing. We've seen agents and landlords looking for increases of around 30 to 60%, and even higher in some circumstances. So we've got friends, you hear in circles that some landlords are even asking 100% increase on rental, and a lot of that is targeted at the larger properties, so 3-bedroom plus kind of condos, which are obviously pretty popular, particularly for those with family and children and wanting space for working from home and even helpers as well. A bit of, I suppose, a comparison for those of you from Hong Kong, and looking at kind of a median, an average type of price. Let's say a 1,500 square foot 3-bed condo in an expat neighbourhood, like River Valley, which is on the edge of Orchard, close to the downtown CBD area. Would maybe rent from anywhere from 7,000 Singapore dollars to $10,000 per month. That's probably the median price, which I think is around 40,000 Hong Kong dollars, up to around 56,000 Hong Kong dollars a month. And that can obviously increase quite substantially, for the bigger properties, the newer properties with more amenities, etc. They can go to 15,000, 20, even up to 30 or 45,000 in places like Sentosa, where a lot of expats generally live. Inflation, cost of living, that's a worldwide problem, not limited to Singapore, and we Singaporeans have been feeling the effect here. Rental, as I mentioned, but even things like private transport. I think Patrick mentioned around cars. Cars are extremely expensive to buy, first of all, in Singapore, but also to lease. So a lot of people favour using Grab, Gojek, which are the kind of the local private transport companies here. And we've seen those kind of prices really increase, along with food costs, dining out, groceries, etc. And that's only going to get worse. We've got an impending GST increase next year from 7 to 8%, and then another increase the year after if it goes through. So things it looks like their inflation's not subsiding at the moment, and with the GST, it's going to get a little bit more expensive here. And availability of employment paths, I've touched on it before, but the requirements are becoming more stringent, but there's still a lot of demand for high caliber professionals in Singapore. So financial considerations, I'll run through some of these quickly, and taxation, is probably one that everyone looks at first of all when considering a new country. So Singapore is well known for its attractive both corporate and personal tax rates. And it follows a territorial basis of taxation, which essentially means that you're only going to be taxed on income that is sourced in Singapore. So similar to Hong Kong, we don't have withholding tax in Singapore, so you'll get your tax bill towards the end of the year, which does place the emphasis on the individual to ensure that they're saving for their tax bills. and something that I suppose we do for a lot of our clients that makes cash flow planning so quite important. So considering, allowing for your tax along with your other objectives that you're saving for. Probably a quick one to note here, employee share plans is a consideration on a few fronts, but the biggest one that people may not realise, if you're kind of getting any stock options or equity-based compensation when you're working in Singapore, that when you actually depart Singapore, there's actually tax is actually deemed on the shares at the time of your departure. So depending on what the price were when you received them and how the market's moved, you could be left with a bit of a hefty tax bill. And be in a position where you can't actually realise the value of those shares because of the vesting requirements to help you pay that tax bill. So something to think about if you are receiving stock options, and something to think about once again in that tax planning. If you have been in Singapore for some time, but also if you are moving here and receiving them, starting to plan for it from the start. And if you do know the kind of duration you'll be here for, to think about how you may fund that tax bill if hopefully markets turn around and those shares increase in value. So taxation, so residency, it's generally 183 days or more. You'll be classified as a Singapore resident. There's no capital gains tax on investments here in Singapore, nor is there tax on investment income. An important one to note, and a kind of I suppose, different from Hong Kong, is that Singapore has double tax agreements with countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, which in particular for Australian residents, the proposed tax residency changes, which we haven't had too many updates of late, unfortunately, but that could be a potential benefit in Singapore having that double tax agreement in place. So retirement schemes, Andre touched on the MPF, and the Singapore retirement scheme is called the Central Provident Fund. A little bit different than Hong Kong is expats here actually aren't mandated to contribute to a retirement scheme. So the Central Provident Fund is actually only open to Singapore citizens and permanent residents. So it's always, retirement planning while you're here is always an important one to think about, because you're not going to get employer contributions. But there is an alternative, which is called the Supplementary Retirement Scheme, or SRS, which is open to all taxpayers, including expats. And it's, I suppose, a common strategy where you can make, similar to superannuation in Australia, you can make contributions to the SRS, which can in fact actually reduce your tax bill here. But there are a number of rules around withdrawals and the timing of that. So you need to make sure that that it's appropriate for you, and taking into account what your goals are and objectives, how long you'll be here for, to think about that before you might consider investing in the SRS or contributing. Andre touched on this as well, but insurance and estate planning, always thinking about whether or not any existing cover is still going to provide you with that level of protection once you move to Singapore. That goes for health cover as well. Always important to read the fine print and have a look at that. Some people, if they've moved for a new job, you might get life insurance, and/or health insurance included within your package. Just important to kind of look at that again, look at the fine print and see what it actually includes, because it might not cover everything that you need. Estate planning, always important to consider updating that estate plan if you're moving to a new country, considering wills, etc., to include assets in a new country. But maybe an important one in Singapore is actually guardianship for those of you with children. So some people may have, a nominated legal guardian for their kids named in their will or as another document. in Singapore, if something was actually to happen to both parents, it's common to see that that permanent guardian, if you're an expat, may not actually live in Singapore. They might be back home or, you know, in a country that you've lived in before. And there often be a delay for those people to get to Singapore to kind of take up their duties. So, you know, they're not always going to be able to jump on a flight straight away and be there that day or the next day. And it's actually the Singapore authorities have a duty to take children to social care if they don't have a guardian in place. So a thing to consider is actually putting in place a temporary guardian in Singapore. And that might be, you know, close friends or neighbours. And that means that your children can actually stay with someone that they know, they're familiar with and they can trust until that permanent guardian can arrive and, you know, take over their duties. And I suppose lastly, managing foreign exchange and currency. You know, as expats or anyone, there's always a lot of, you know, attention given to what's happening in the markets, you know, where markets are going, up or down, you know, what to invest in or where to invest. But often a fundamental risk that's often overlooked is actually managing the currency as part of that investment planning. So, you know, you might have been in Singapore or Hong Kong and other countries before that. You might have multiple bank accounts, assets in different countries, and just thinking about when you actually might, transfer assets to a new country or transfer assets back home. It's an important thing to think about. And a lot of people kind of fall into that trap of, you know, becoming, you know, foreign exchange experts and trying to time it. But there are a lot more things to think about than just the timing of when you might move, you know, your cash from your bank account. Thinking about, are your current investments positioned correctly? And that might be thinking about where you want to retire. So what's your home currency base? Are there any tax implications if you invest in a certain country? You know, so thinking about if you want to invest in Australia, you might have withholding tax on interest or from unfranked dividends. If you have a mortgage on a property in another country, do you move money back there regularly to pay for that? So kind of planning that out. How often do you make those transfers? Obviously trying to minimise the fees that you may have. It's generally not a great idea to be transferring every month and copying a fee every time you do that. So that's it for me. I think, you know, international relocations, you know, even for seasoned expats who have done it all before, and Patrick spoke about, you know, a fair few of those things that we need to think about. I think the best tip I can give is start the planning early, particularly, you know, if you're an expat and have been living in another country, thinking about what your kind of long-term goals are, when you might return home, your retirement, all that kind of stuff. Start that planning process, 12 months out, 18 months out, because there are things around, you know, MPF in Hong Kong or SRS in Singapore, your investments and currency to kind of think about, when making that move home. I think that's all from me, Andre. You might want to just take yourself off mute there, mate.
Zoom 101. Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. And thank you, Shaun, for that comprehensive view, if you like, of, you know, what it looks like relocating back to Singapore. Now, there is, again, if any of you missed any of that, you know, we will be sending a recording of this to the participants, so not to worry, and we'll be able to have any, you know, continue any of the conversations that Patrick, Shaun, and myself have started in terms of what to consider. There have been some questions that has been answered online. Patrick, you're okay to take this one in terms of the price ranges of property?
Well, I really think Shaun said it. So
yeah.
Sort of River Valley, 7,000 to 10,000 Sing dollars, the equivalent of 40 to 56,000 Hong Kong dollars for a sort of 3-bedroom. Yeah. As Shaun also mentioned, the big driver is proximity to the school that you choose. Seems to be a big driver for where people live in Singapore. Okay.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you. Last one here for, are there FX brokers other than banks you recommend for large sums transfer, please? Yes, we do have FX engagements that we can provide their details on if you'd like. And again, we'll be reaching out to you as a participant, and we can definitely follow that up for you. If there aren't any other questions, in the interest of time, I'll stop it there. Patrick and Shaun, thank you so much for your attendance. There's so much value that participants and myself, for that matter, that I got that I've received from this the 40-minute that we just did. And for those of you that have logged on, thank you so much for your for attending this webinar. Please stay safe and hope to see you all soon in some way or form. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. Bye.
Thanks, Andre.